Hey everyone!
Today, we look into a disappearance so unsettling and highly suspicious that detectives now believe the official story has completely crumbled.
A woman named Lynette Hooker mysteriously vanished in the Bahamas
After her husband, Brian, claimed she just fell off a dinghy into the open ocean.
But now, new witnesses are coming forward, reporting a massive splash near the couple's sailboat hours later. A distress flare was reportedly seen streaking across the dark water. The boat's tracking signal suddenly went dead. And what investigators allegedly uncovered on that sailboat might be the biggest nightmare Brian Hooker has ever faced. Before we begin,
Make sure to subscribe, because this mystery gets darker the deeper we look.
Lynette Hooker was supposed to be living her ultimate dream, sailing through the beautiful Bahamas with her husband aboard their sailboat, Soulmate. But the night she vanished, that dream twisted into something straight out of a cold psychological thriller.
According to Brian Hooker,
The couple left a local marina and boarded a small dinghy, heading toward their sailboat anchored offshore. Then suddenly, Lynette allegedly fell backward into rough water, carrying the boat keys, the emergency kill switch, and her heavy dry bag, all at the very same moment. Brian claimed he drifted helplessly in the dark for hours, while Lynette vanished forever beneath the waves. But almost immediately, experienced sailors began spotting major holes in his story. The water conditions that night were reportedly dead calm. A photograph taken near sunset showed barely any waves in the harbor. Veteran boaters familiar with those Bahamian waters started questioning how a healthy adult woman could just vanish in shallow water only a short distance from the shore. Then came the massive timeline problems. Brian claimed Lynette went missing shortly after they left shore. Yet witnesses later reported hearing a loud splash near the sailboat, Soulmate, much later that night.
Not near the tiny dinghy.
Right near the sailboat itself. Another witness reportedly saw a flare moving horizontally across the water, instead of arching skyward like a standard emergency signal.
That single detail changed everything.
Because a horizontal flare is not what drifting victims typically fire. Into the darkness, while desperately begging for rescue. Then, investigators uncovered something even stranger. The sailboat's tracking system. Basically, the vessel's electronic location signature reportedly went dark around 9:29 p.m., only to return the next morning. During that exact time frame, Brian spent nearly an hour below deck on Soulmate with officers right after being rescued. Authorities eventually seized the entire vessel, wrapping it in yellow crime scene tape while hauling off electronics, personal devices, and potential forensic evidence. And the deeper detectives looked into Brian Hooker's account, the less believable it actually became. Because according to rescue teams intimately familiar with that precise coastline, where Brian, he allegedly drifted ashore, but his story was practically impossible. The first responder who pulled Brian Hooker off the shoreline that morning immediately sensed something was off. And it wasn't because of some obvious, dramatic clue. No blood, no obvious signs of violence. But because his story simply didn't fit the actual geography of the Bahamas. Brian claimed he drifted helplessly across the Sea of Abaco all night, before finally washing ashore near Marsh Harbor around 4 in the morning. He claimed he frantically knocked on doors looking for help. He even said he waved at a passing car, but it refused to stop. But here is the catch. The spot where he supposedly landed was no normal neighborhood. According to local rescue teams, the area is mostly dark scrub, razor-sharp rocks, and nearly impassable terrain. One veteran responder described the shoreline in brutal detail. To the west was thick, overgrown brush stretching into pitch blackness. To the south lay rough inlets and tangled brush, virtually impossible to cross in the dark. But directly north, barely 150 yards away, a brightly lit boatyard was glowing like a beacon over the water. Any survivor stranded there would naturally walk toward those lights.
towards civilization and immediate help.
Instead, Brian claimed he walked the exact opposite way. That single contradiction became one of the most damaging holes in his entire story.
Locals who knew the area said no exhausted survivor would ever willingly stumble
through pitch-black brush while injured, bleeding, and terrified,
when obvious help was right there.
It gets worse. Brian reportedly claimed the sharp rocks shredded his feet during his trek.
But when searchers found him,
he was still wearing slip-on sandals.
No bare feet, no bleeding, still wearing sandals that looked completely untouched by the sharp rocks. Then came another massive detail investigators simply couldn't ignore. Brian allegedly claimed he knocked on just 2 doors before giving up and heading to the boatyard.
But locals pointed out that the nearby neighborhood was packed with occupied homes.
Families live there all year round.
If a soaking wet stranger showed up in distress at 4 in the morning, residents definitely would have helped.
Called the police,
or called search teams. Yet not a single homeowner ever came forward to say Brian Hooker knocked on their door.
And that story about the passing car sounded even more suspicious.
Marsh Harbor is a tight-knit island community where locals always stop to help strangers,
especially during an emergency.
Rescue officials openly called Brian's story completely far-fetched and impossible.
One detective even admitted the chances of his story being true were close to 0.
But what happened next pushed this investigation into a much darker place.
While rescue teams desperately combed the dark ocean for a woman believed to have fallen overboard,
some detectives quietly started to wonder
if Lynette Hooker had ever actually gone into the water at all.
As investigators began piecing together the timeline,
their focus abruptly shifted from the open sea to the sailboat itself.
The vessel called Soulmate was no longer just seen
as the site of a tragic accident. Instead, it looked like the epicenter of a dark mystery. The breakthrough came directly from electronic tracking data.
Official reports linked to the investigation reveal
Soulmate's AI system, the tracking signal used to broadcast their location, vanished around 9:29 that night.
Then, almost unbelievably,
the signal returned the next morning, long after Brian was already rescued.
For seasoned sailors,
that gap raised major red flags because these systems do not just fail for hours without reason. Usually, someone has to turn them off, cut power, or tamper with them. Then, detectives uncovered another disturbing fact. Once rescue crews pulled Brian from the shoreline early that morning, they brought him right back to Soulmates with police officers in tow.
Witnesses estimated Brian spent nearly an hour below deck, inside the cabin,
before search operations really ramped up.
During that window, authorities believe he had full access to the vessel's electronics, controls, communication systems, and every single hidden compartment.
That single detail chilled everyone following the case.
If there was key evidence hidden inside the Soulmate, Brian had plenty of alone time with it before police officially seized the vessel. Later, the United States Coast Guard taped off the vessel as a crime scene and seized several electronic devices. Insiders close to the case described these devices as a potential forensic goldmine. Investigators reportedly recovered computers, tablets, GPS systems, and hardware connected to the boat's engines. Modern marine engines often hold telemetric data capable of tracking exact movements, run times, and power surges. But the most unsettling clues came from witnesses living near the anchorage that night. One person reportedly spotted a flare firing horizontally, low across the water instead of up into the sky. Another heard a loud splash near Soulmate, hours after Brian claimed Lynette was already gone.
That timeline is devastating because by then,
based on Brian's own story, absolutely no one should have been near the vessel. That single splash changed everything. Detectives began quietly wondering if Lynette might have actually returned to Soulmate sometime after her reported accident. Others wondered if someone or something else went overboard from the yacht later that night. And once those grim possibilities entered the investigation, Brian Hooker's initial account started falling apart, piece by piece. Because now it was no longer a question of whether his story sounded suspicious. The real question was this: what really happened on board Soulmate after dark when no one else was supposed to be there? By the time cadaver dogs finally touched down in the Bahamas, the case had shifted far beyond a standard missing person search. Search and rescue teams had spent days scanning open water, patrolling local shorelines and combing nearby islands. But behind closed doors, detectives began focusing on a far more terrifying possibility. What if Lynette Hooker was never actually lost at sea? Their focus slowly shifted toward remote spots around lovers' quarters and secluded beaches where an island local might easily hide incriminating evidence. Teams quietly combed the shallow beaches, thick mangroves, loose sand, and active construction zones where the earth had been heavily disturbed. One volunteer recalled walking along sections of shoreline where every patch of land resembled a grave because the dirt was so freshly turned. Then, those closest to Lynette began sharing details that made this mystery far more sinister. According to close family, Lynette had tried walking away from Brian several times before she vanished. Her daughter later revealed that Lynette actually had plans to escape the marriage just days before she disappeared. At one point, relatives reportedly begged her not to go, terrified of what he might do. Now, those desperate warnings feel haunting. Detectives and search volunteers quickly turned their focus to Brian's behavior following her disappearance, rather than frantically searching night and day for his missing wife. Witnesses described moments where his cold reactions seemed completely disconnected from the unfolding emergency. As volunteers risked their lives searching treacherous waters, Brian was reportedly spotted hanging back at the marina, staying on board, rather than actively spearheading the search for his wife. Then came the mounting contradictions, the perfectly calm seas, the impossible route along the shore, the silent tracking system, the emergency flare, and that heavy splash heard near Soulmate hours later. The shifting stories about what Lynette actually screamed from the dark water, and how veteran sailors openly dismiss Brian's entire timeline as impossible. Alone, each detail raises questions. Combined, they present a grim reality that police can no longer ignore. Yet, beneath all the dark theories, one cold fact remains. Lynette Hooker has never been located, leaving no physical trace and zero forensic answers. There is no murder charge, only a missing woman, a deeply troubled timeline, and a sailboat sitting at the dark heart of a truly haunting mystery. Deep in the Bahamas, the real truth of that night remains. Perhaps it lies buried beneath that freshly turned sand. Or maybe it is locked inside the digital data recovered from Soulmate. Or perhaps it rests with the one person investigators suspect knows precisely what went down after night fell over the Sea of Abaco. But until those secrets surface, one chilling question will continue to hang over this case. What truly happened to Lynette Hooker on board Soulmate that night?